So welcome back. Good to see everybody. And thanks for coming back. Okay, so first a note about the recording. If we get to a point today where we're going to do any kind of Mussar sharing, I will signal to Rabbi Russell to pause the recording. And then if we go back to talking more generally, we'll continue the recording so that no one has to worry about sharing anything about themselves that will be recorded and available outside the group. So that's how we're going to do that. Okay. So what I'm going to do today, well, first of all, let's start with a bracha, as is our general custom, a blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, Rabbi Russell. I should have waited for you to get that up. Okay, so we're going to get a little bit deeper, more deeply into some of the ideas and concepts and tools that make up the Mussar toolbox. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is to introduce, first of all, the midot, and then the concept of kibush and tikkun, okay? So Rabbi Russell is going to put up on the screen a list of 18 midot, I hope, that are in this week's handout packet. There we go. So a couple of things about these midot. As you see, these are 18 midot given by Menachem Mendel Leffin of Satanov in his book Cheshbon HaNefesh. If I remember correctly, I spoke a little bit about this last time, this book. But as a quick reminder, this book was created by Menachem Mendel Leffin of Satanov, who was considered to be an enlightened rabbi, an enlightenment rabbi, if you will, and therefore was open to the current intellectual currents of his time. And one of the most popular books of the Enlightenment was Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And it was in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography that these midot, obviously by Franklin not called midot, but virtues, and that Menachem Mendel took that list of midot and brought it into the book that he wrote somewhat in the early 19th century called Cheshbon HaNefesh. And this list is a list, it doesn't quite follow his order, but is nonetheless comprehensive, right? And so I'm going to just go through them quickly. Obviously, we'll have time to go into some of them more deeply. And to Marilyn's question, Rabbi Russell, yes, I think this should be made available somehow to people. So we will take care of that. First order, or orderliness, seder. All of your actions and possessions should be orderly, each and every one in a set place at a set time. Let your thoughts always be free to deal with that which lies ahead of you. On the surface, this is a very simple virtue, if you will, and yet it becomes a very critical one in terms of Mussar work, because if you are continually distracted by the disorder in your life, then you have less time, space, and energy to devote to serving the other. So that's kind of the underlying thought. The next one is mitinut, deliberation, which basically means take a moment to pause, particularly when you're speaking. There's nothing that gets us into more trouble than speaking without thinking. Then we have sabranut, which I think we might have mentioned last week. When something bad happens to you and you did not have the power to avoid it, do not aggravate the situation even more through wasted grief. Right? There's nothing more useless than wasting energy, call it grief, when there's nothing you can do about a situation. Right? So that gives you some idea of the quality of these midot. And since you're going to get a copy of this, I won't go through all 18 of them here because it takes up a lot of time. Okay. They're arranged in the book as 13 major midot and 5 minor midot, but we do not distinguish between them. Okay, so there are 18 midot. Stop there. Hold it there. Most of them are fairly self-explanatory. Some of them are a little surprising. So I want to take a look here at humility or anava, which is clearly one of the central midot of the entire Mussar process. But look how Menachem Mendel defines it. Always seek to learn wisdom from everyone, to recognize your failings and correct them. In doing so, you will learn to stop thinking about your virtues and you will take your mind off your friends' faults. This, I think, is quite a different take on humility than we usually associate with it. The idea that humility is some kind of self-abnegation, right? Some kind of disappearance of the self. That is not one that is natural to Jewish thinking. Rather, this formulation, I think, captures what is a more quintessentially Jewish approach, which is that when you approach the other, any person, one should be open to what one can learn from them. And that once one identifies something that one can learn from somebody else, sometimes even how not to be, that person in a sense becomes your teacher. And your relationship to your teacher is always going to be a little bit deferential and different. And more importantly, the second sentence, if you try to learn from everyone, you will stop thinking about your virtues and will take your mind off your friends' faults. So it's, I think, a really lovely interpretation of the idea of humility. Okay, so those are the midot that constitute most of the work that we do in the first part of our Mussar program, which is called kibush, right? So there are two important words that you're going to want to remember. One is called kibush, and the other is called tikkun, right? Kibush is the first stage of our Mussar work. It literally means suppress or capture. And we understand it as meaning to restrain ourselves from acting from a closed nefesh. So let me review sort of the phenomenology, the picture of the human psyche that we are positing here, right? We are using a metaphorical structure in which we envision human beings as being nefashot, right? Souls, but using the word in Hebrew for soul that is nefesh. So it's kind of like living creatures, right? In a certain sense, we share the idea of a nefesh with everything that is alive. Everything that is alive has a nefesh. The human nefesh, as it were, has the ability when it is maintained in a semi-permeable state, to allow us to be, to ingest, as it were, a neshama, a second level of soulness that comes from outside of us, right? Taken from the biblical idea that God breathed into the human being. And so this neshama, when it is able to flow freely through our nefesh and connect to its source in what we call the ruach, right, precipitates yetzer tov behavior, good behavior, good relationships. When the nefesh is closed, the neshama cannot flow, and the result of a non-flowing nefesh, a non-flowing neshama, is yetzer hara behavior, right? So in a certain sense, we don't decide to either follow our yetzer hara or our yetzer tov, but rather we decide how we're going to maintain our nefesh so that we can experience yetzer tov or yetzer hara if we close it, right? All right, let me stop there for a second and see if anybody has a question. Marilyn has a question, is this a kind of I-thou relationship? And that's a very common association. There's no question that this picture of the human psyche is, I believe, what helped Buber devise his idea of an I-thou relationship. So I'm going to make sure that we recognize that Buber comes second, right? He doesn't invent it and then Judaism takes it up. Rather, he extracts it from his exposure to Judaism, particularly his exposure to mystical Judaism through his grandparents and their Hasidic background. So if you know anything about Buber, he spent a lot of time with his grandfather, who was a Hasid. And so he imbued a lot of this Kabbalistic material and then refashioned it as an I-thou in his famous work. It's also very much at the heart of the work of his friend and compatriot, Franz Rosenzweig, and even more so in the philosopher Emanuel Levinas, whom, as I may have mentioned, has a major influence on my work. Now, the difference, however, not to get on a tangent, the difference between Buber on the one hand and Rosenzweig and Levinas on the other is that Buber sees this I-thou relationship as one of mutuality, two entities on the same level, right? Whereas both Rosenzweig and Levinas see this as an asymmetrical relationship, that the neshama that enters us, using my language, comes from a certain height, right? It's a divine energy, and therefore it comes with a certain level of commandedness, right? So that we act out of our yetzer hatov, not because we get anything back from the other, but because we owe it, as it were, to the other, right? So I don't want to get too far into that, but that is a difference that I wanted to just make clear. Okay, so the idea of kibush is to create a modality by which we can recognize when our nefesh is closing or closed, and can then work to mitigate against its closure, or at least to soften and control our desire to act out of yetzer hara, right? So in a certain sense, the kibush process is one in which we want to get to know our yetzer hara. We want to get to know how we experience it. what happens to us? How do we feel the nefesh closing, right? When the nefesh closes, can we be conscious enough to avoid the Yetzer Hara behavior that closed nefesh is going to inevitably precipitate, right? And can we even get to the point of diffusing that trigger and allowing our nefesh to go back to being semi-permeable and allowing the neshama to flow? So that's kind of the goal of the process of kibush. And one of the major tools that we use in the process of kibush is what we call cheshbon hanefesh, right? An accounting of the soul, using a particular middah to view and evaluate our behavior. Okay, so the practice of kibush guides us to experience the Yetzer Hara without acting it out. We learn to identify the individual experience of our Yetzer being affected by another person's Yetzer, and to contain the unmediated impulse to act, right? So let's take an example. Let's see, what's a good example here? I am at the, I am a what do you call a person who serves coffee? I forget the word. At Starbucks, right? Because help me out here. What's the word?
Barista.
Right. Thank you. Okay. So I'm a barista at Starbucks. And a person comes in, and they're double parked, and of course they haven't had their morning coffee, and they're not in the greatest shape, and they're extremely impatient. And in front of them is an older person who is having trouble finding the exact change that they want to pay for their coffee. So they're sitting there and time is going by, and the second person is getting angrier and angrier. Finally, the first person moves away. When the second person comes up to the counter, he or she barks at the barista in a very unpleasant way, etc. Okay, so here the second person is acting out of Yetzer Hara energy, right? They are impatient. They are out of order, right? Because if they had been in order, they would have probably left home in time to park and not have to be worried about the fact that they were double parked. So all of these midot are kind of piling up to cause them to act out of Yetzer Hara energy. And the recipient of that energy is the poor person behind the counter, the barista. Right? Now this is serious because this poor barista is a single mother, and she is working for just to maintain herself and her one child. And during the course of the day, she's going to be barraged by more than just one person acting out from their Yetzer Hara. This, of course, closes her nefesh, so that when she goes home, she enters into her apartment with a closed nefesh, and her poor little boy, who's been waiting for her all day, and comes running over to her with a picture that he drew for her, and hands it to her, and she tosses it away and says, "Get out of here. I have a headache. Leave me alone. Go play. Go watch TV." Right? And that poor little kid will grow up to be a serial killer, right? Because of the way he has been treated, right? So there is a cumulative effect to acting out of one's Yetzer Hara. On the other hand, if the person waiting online could feel his or her nefesh closing could say to him or herself, I can feel my nefesh closing. I want to focus on the middah of savlanut. This is a situation that I can't do anything about. And I really don't need to engender all of these bad feelings because they're not going to help me in one little bit. So why don't I just take a deep breath and let things happen the way they're going to happen? Let my nefesh relax. Keep my neshama flowing. And so when I get up to the counter, I say to the barista, instead of barking at her some unpleasantry, I say to her, boy, this must be a tough morning for you. And I show a certain kind of empathy or sympathy. I've changed my relationship. I've changed that interaction. And although my example of the serial killer is obviously silly, the point is not entirely silly, because it is, in fact, these little everyday interchanges that we have with each other and with people around us that create environments in which much greater and much more serious evil can accrue, right? So the idea of doing cheshbon hanefesh, let's say we're the second person in this scenario, and I barked at the person and I did everything wrong. Okay, now I go home and I want to do cheshbon hanefesh, and this is going to be my Mussar moment. And so I'm going to sit down with my journal and I'm going to identify, right? So every piece of journaling requires that we sit down and we go through it our mind, let's say the last 24 or 48 hours, and we pick a moment that we feel that we've acted out of our Yetzer Hara. And I want to now write down what that moment was. So I write down that when I was at the Starbucks counter, I impatiently and totally undeservedly yelled at a person because I was waiting online and I was frustrated, right? So number one, I might ask myself, where did I feel this frustration manifest itself, right? Because I want to get used to that. I want to be able to identify that, right? So I want to say, well, maybe it was in my gut. I felt myself tense. Maybe it was in my shoulders, right? So I want to make a note to be aware that when I get that same feeling again, that is a sign that my nefesh is closing, right? Now, if I had it to do over again, what might I have done had I identified this moment, right? And what I might have done is to meditate to myself on the middah of savlanut or metinut, right? Either learn to speak, to take a breath before you speak, to take a pause, or savlanut, not to engender grief when there's nothing you can do about it. Or anava, and in fact, let me interrupt myself here to respond to that. When we do Mussar, and when we do cheshbon hanefesh, we are essentially doing laboratory work. And as such, we are abstracting out of life particular moments and analyzing them through the lens of particular midot. But in real life, the midot oftentimes occur in groups, right? It's not just one middah. So yes, you might have accessed the middah of anava, or seder, or mitinut, or shtika, silence, which we'll learn about later. So if you look back at that list, shtika is not silence in the sense that you shouldn't talk, but rather before you speak, make sure that what you're going to say is going to be helpful, right? So those become some of the choices that one becomes familiar with as one becomes more familiar with the process. Lucy, you have a question. You want to unmute?
I just wanted to ask you if you can define the terms like midot. I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know what it is.
Thank you. Okay, so that's great. And if anybody else has that problem as I go along, obviously, some of these words have become so second nature to me that it's hard for me to recognize. So midot are character traits. There's really no better definition. Or virtues, as Ben Franklin called them. The word midah itself comes from the Hebrew word for measure, right? And was originally applied to these character traits because they measure our character, right? In a certain sense. Kibush, as I mentioned, is restraint or control. I've mentioned a couple of midot, so let me define them again. Savlanut is patience, anava is humility, right? Yeah, and you'll see it when you get this list, right? All of these are defined, and the Hebrew is translated. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm still, is it kibush?
Well, in modern Hebrew, it's kibush.
Kibush.
Yes.
And that's like the moment when you catch yourself?
Kibush means the process of controlling your Yetzer Hara. But the word itself means suppress. And probably in early Mussar literature was really understood as a kind of suppression or, a suppression of evil characteristics. Right? I prefer to use the word not so much repress, but rather more like suppress, right? To recognize and control these behaviors. Yes, Deborah, put the kibosh on it. The Hebrew does somehow work its way into English, and I never took the time to look up that derivation, but I'm pretty sure that it is accurate, that originally the English idea of putting the kibosh on something comes from the Hebrew kibush. Okay. So the practice of nefesh, of cheshbon hanefesh, is essential. We ask ourselves, we identify a Mussar moment. We identify perhaps a middah that we could have used to transform the behavior that we actually engaged in. We ask ourselves, if we want to go more deeply into it, what was it in that situation that, in fact, caused our nefesh to contract, right? Because if we understand that the contraction of the nefesh is metaphorically a way of describing a defensive behavior posture, then a defensive behavior posture can only have occurred because of some perceived danger. And sometimes asking yourself, if my nefesh closed, what was I afraid of? Then you begin to more deeply unravel the context or that particular interaction, right? So in this case of this person behind, standing in line at Starbucks, what was he or she afraid of? Well, there was the real fear, partly, of getting a ticket, right? Their car is double parked outside while they're waiting online. Obviously, the solution to that fear, or that what gave rise to that fear, is not anyone else's fault but the person, right? So their defensive posture is aimed at the wrong at the wrong person, right? They should have thought of that beforehand. So if they in fact recognize that their behavior was precipitated by their decision to park illegally, then certainly one of the things they need to put on their list of what they learned from this experience is not to park illegally, right? Secondly, why did they park illegally? Well, because they were in a rush. Why were they in a rush? Because they left home late, right? And they had to get to work. And if they didn't get to work, they might get some kind of demerit from their employer, and that's serious, right? So they had these various and things to be concerned about, that their defenses were invoked. But again, the defense was aimed at the wrong perpetrator, right? So one of the things that, again, that they have to do in the course of their nefesh, their cheshbon nefesh, is to recognize when they, in fact, have put themselves in positions where they feel the need to defend themselves, and the only person they're defending themselves from is themselves, right? And ideally, once they recognize what they're really afraid of, then the next question is, was the fear legitimate, right? Or in this case, was the object of the fear legitimate, right? Was there anything to be accomplished by aiming their Yetzer hara at the people around them in the store? Would that have allayed their fear in any substantive way? And the answer has to be no, right? So cheshbon nefesh is really an attempt to honestly evaluate our behavior and to begin to catalog the ways in which we need to change that behavior in order to change the way we respond to other people. So then the last thing we might do in this particular journal entry is to make a list of what we could do differently to avoid this situation, or what we could even have done differently in the store to help alleviate those parts of our fear that were legitimate, right? And so obviously, as I've already mentioned, we might invoke the midot of patience, of deliberation, of orderliness, of humility, etc., to help mitigate our behavior. But we might also have some on-the-spot solutions, right? So if we have a legitimate fear that if we spend too much time in the store, we're going to be in trouble, then we might have put our hand out and said to the person in front of us, I'll pay for your drink and you can stand to the side and give me back the money when you find it. In which case I move the whole process along at a pace that's at least as fast as I think I might need it. And if the person has found the money after I get my drink, I take it. And if they don't, would it be so impossible for me to just say, forget it, for the $2.10 and walk to the car, right? So there are, in our everyday engagements with people, methodologies by which we can functionally diffuse the impact of our Yetzer Hara and the hardening of our nefesh. And the only way to begin to put that into practice is to evaluate clearly and honestly those things when they occur, so that we can begin to build up a kind of new muscle memory, a new way of habituating ourselves, right? To the point where we, in a sense, refuse, to the extent humanly possible, to ever act out of our Yetzer Hara, right? To become so attuned to the way in which our body signals to us that we're being triggered by something. And we are so skilled at applying the midot that we need to having recognized the Yetzer Hara, to disarm it, that we find ourselves in a significantly different behavioral model. Okay, any questions or comments at this point before I move on? Okay. So what I'd like to do now is take let's say 5 minutes to put you all in a, let's see, I don't see on my screen, Rabbi Russell, where I can put people into breakout groups. Can you do that?
I can, yep. And you want to pause recording and let people go into breakout rooms?
Yeah, just arbitrarily put 2 people in every group we can. And we're going to ask people to talk to their now chavruta about a Mussar moment that they may have had in the past 24 hours, 48 hours, and how they might, number one, whether they can imagine where in their body they experience that Mussar moment, and number two, if possible, which midot they think might have been appropriate to apply. Now this is, I know, we're just starting and it's very awkward, but it'll give us a little bit of a feel for things. And then we'll come back and we'll share, okay? So 5 minutes tops. We'll be done for today. Number one, in the Center for Contemporary Mussar program, Kibush is the first part of our program. So students work on the Kibush Midot and the process of Cheshbon HaNefesh, along with the study, which we're not doing right in this class, of the text of Mesilat Yesharim, Paths of the Upright, as their study segment of the program. And at the end of about 18 months, give or take, we move on to the second part of the program, which I'm going to just mention and introduce very briefly. And then we may be able to look at it more closely when we get to a later point in this series. And that is the process of what we call, or what the Mussar teachers call, tikkun, or transformation. Right. Transformation, or tikkun, is defined, if you will, as reaching that level of spiritual achievement whereby we are able to act from a semi-permeable nefesh constantly and consistently. Right? So we are no longer trying to identify the Yetzer Hara and control it, but rather we are able to use the Yetzer Hara as a constant wake-up call to transform the very status of our nefesh. It's a somewhat more complicated and complex process. And in the tikkun process, we depart, as it were, from the midot of cheshbon hanefesh, and we begin to use the midot that are identified in a text called Tomar Dovara by Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, who has 13 midot of tikkun, which I'm not giving you the list right now, but which is a much different approach, right? So I'm just pointing out that this is a two-level program, as it were. The first part is kibush, getting control of the Yetzer Hara. The second part is transformation, or tikkun, in which we actually kind of work on the stance of our nefesh in the world. Okay, that's all I'll say by introduction today for that. I want to close by giving you your homework. So number one, I would like, and obviously I don't have enforcement power here, so this is up to you to decide whether you want to play along. But I'd like you to try to engage in the process of nefesh, of cheshbon hanefesh every day but Shabbos from now until next Monday, so that we can talk on Monday, right? Tuesday, right? So if you can't do it every day, I understand, but if you can do it as often as possible, no more than once a day, take a journal, a notebook, a computer program, you can use it on your Word program, and keep a journal which consists of one, identifying a Mussar moment, identifying, if possible, where you experience the closing of your nefesh physically. 2, what middah might have helped you. And 3, what you can do going forward to help remember to use this middah in these kinds of situations. Right? That might include, for example, just memorizing the middah and keeping it with you. It might include finding a prayer or a psalm or a verse from the Torah that reminds you of this middah. It's some kind of way of remembering. Right? So that's your Mussar homework, with the addition, Rabbi Russell is going to send around a piece called Torah as a Spiritual Garment, which will function as our kind of Torah study for next week. So we'll spend a few minutes on that piece. Betsy, you have a question?
I do. I lost you when you were saying that you do the engaging in writing down a Mussar moment, then try to experience where we physically feel the closing of our nefesh. And then I try to identify the middah, which may have helped. I think you had a fourth point.
What you might do differently, or how you would remember that middah.
Okay, and the other part is, can you send that list out? Or maybe can Rabbi Russell, when she sends out the Torah as a spiritual garment thing, because the piece that you just referred to, because without having that, and I didn't get everything written down, then it's kind of hard to.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
every week there's a follow-up email to this class, and I just put my email address in the side, so if anybody's not getting it, just let me know. There's a follow-up email to this class, including the recording, and then any of these documents that Rabbi Stone is either sharing or asking you to read.
Thank you.
Okay. So I don't think I have a